Malcolm McKinnon, age 49, his wife, Janet, their children, Alexander and Kenneth. In the margin, in a clerk's hand, strong, healthy man. That is one line from a passenger list written in Scotland in 1852. It is free to read, and if your family came to Australia out of the Highlands, a line like that one may have your own surname on it. This is the story of the ship that made those lists the only thing left. She sailed out of Campbeltown on Boxing Day, 1852, with 756 people aboard, drawn off Skye, Harris and North Uist. She reached Australia 7 months later, carrying 380. Everything in between was written down, and that is why you can still go looking. Here is what this film covers. Who was actually put on that ship, and who decided it? The 4 days of storm before she had properly begun. The 3 months she spent tied up in an Irish harbour, and what came off her in that time. The 17 children who were sent home alone. And at the end, the part that cost you nothing. Exactly where those lists are today, what they tell you, and the one thing they will never tell you. Stay for that, even if the history is already familiar. Every week we trace another name. If yours should be next, subscribe and drop it below. Start with the number, because the number is the argument. The potato blight reached the west of Scotland in 1846, and it did not leave. 6 years of failed crops, uneven from glen to glen and island to island. And by 1851, the relief committees had reached the conclusion that relief committees reach. It would be cheaper to move people than to keep feeding them. The Highland and Island Emigration Society was set up the following year by private subscription to alleviate destitution by promoting and assisting immigration. That is the Society's own language. Read it twice and you can hear both halves of it, the charity and the clearance, sitting in the same sentence. Skye went first, because Skye was worst. By the time the Society wound up, Skye alone had supplied more than half of everyone it ever sent. In July 1852, in a single month, 951 souls were sent from the Highlands, and Scotland's People Records, where they came off, the lands of Lord MacDonald of Waternish and the estates of Skye Bost and Burnsdale. Those are not abstractions, those are somebody's townships emptied by name. By Christmas, the Society had chartered the Hercules, and 756 people walked up her gangway at Campbeltown. Although here is the first small honesty of this film. Scotland's People's Own Records Guide says 758. 2 people, 1 archive, 2 answers. Hold on to that, because by the end of this story the counting stops being a detail and becomes the whole point. She sailed on the 26th of December, and then, for 4 days, she did not really go anywhere. A storm took her almost immediately, and she turned and ran for shelter in the Clyde, anchoring at Rothesay to make repairs. On the 30th of December, riding at anchor, the master wrote a letter. Captain Baintoun was not a panicking man. This is what he put on paper. We have a case of fever and another of smallpox and measles on board, but I have no doubt that by the judicious arrangements of Mr. Carey, the ship's surgeon and his assistant, we shall prevent it spreading. Remember the name he puts his confidence in. Mr. Carey. We are going to come back to Mr. Carey. 2 men died while the ship lay in the storms. We do not have their names in the sources readable for this film, and we are not going to invent them for you. What we can say is what it meant mechanically for everybody else on board. 2 entries in a list stopped being a plan and became a record. That distinction is the whole trade of family history, and it is worth 30 seconds of your time. Before the crossing, a passenger list is an intention. It says who a committee decided should go. Afterwards, it is evidence. It says who was there. The Hercules is the ship where the gap between those 2 things opened up wider than on any other vessel the Society ever sent, and that is precisely why her paperwork is worth reading. She sailed again in the first week of January. 19 days later, she put into an Irish harbour, and she did not leave it for 3 months. On the 20th of January, 1853, the Hercules anchored at Queenstown, in County Cork. Queenstown is not on the map now. It was renamed Cove in 1920, and if you have ever been to Cork, you have almost certainly stood on the same quay, because it is the one the Titanic called at. By the time she anchored, more than 50 cases of smallpox had been found aboard, and typhus with them. 15 of the crew were taken off to the Naval Hospital on Haulbowline Island. A hulk was towed in and turned into a floating fever hospital. The smallpox cases went ashore to the hospital on Haulbowline, and on that same island a large shed was thrown up to hold the passengers who were still well, which was by then a shrinking category. Over those 3 months in quarantine, 56 people died. And the surgeon, Lawrence Kerr E., the man Captain Baintoun had named in his letter, the reason the captain had no doubt, was one of the 56. So was Mrs. Innes, the ship's matron. The 2 people on board whose entire job was the health of everybody else both died doing it, in a harbour, in sight of land, without ever having crossed anything. There is a temptation, telling a story like this, to reach for a villain. The contemporary press did. On the 18th of February, the Cork Examiner wrote that the case of the Hercules was without precedent in the history of official mismanagement and neglect. That is a real quotation from a real newspaper, and it is also a newspaper doing what newspapers do. What the record supports is narrower and, honestly, worse. Nobody set out to do this. People were loaded onto a ship in winter, in numbers, from districts that were already sick, and the sickness went with them. Tradition, in a lot of families, remembers a cruelty. The paperwork remembers a system. Both of those can be true, and only one of them is written down. 17 children came off the Hercules orphaned and were sent back to Scotland. Sit with the arithmetic of that for a moment. Their parents had been selected, assisted, listed, sailed, and had died within sight of the Irish coast. The children were then returned to the exact districts the Society had just spent a year and a subscription list emptying, sent home to a home that had been the problem. We do not know what happened to them, not in anything readable for this film. 17 children went back up the west coast in 1853, and the record we can follow does not follow them. If your family tradition includes an ancestor who was orphaned young and raised by relatives in Skye, or Harris, or North Uist in the 1850s, that is not proof of anything. But it is a question worth taking to the records, and by the end of this film you will know where they are. On the 14th of April 1853, the Hercules finally sailed for Australia carrying 380 of the original 756. The rest were not all dead. That is the part people get wrong. 56 had died, 17 children had gone home. The remainder, several hundred of them, were put onto other emigrant ships and sent on separately. And the State Library of Victoria puts what that meant in one sentence that I am not going to improve on. In many cases, families were separated, never to see each other again. Not lost at sea, not killed. Separated at a quarantine station by administration and scattered across a dozen different ships to a continent the size of Europe. Brothers landing at different ports, months apart with no way to find each other afterwards. That is why Australian families descended from this crossing so often hit a wall at exactly this generation, and it is why the Society's own paperwork is sometimes the only bridge across it. She made Port Adelaide on the 20th of July, where 194 people left the ship. She reached Melbourne on the 3rd of August, and 183 walked off. Now, 194 and 183 is 377. 380 sailed from Cork. 3 people are unaccounted for in the best source available to us between an Irish harbour and an Australian wharf. Other accounts of this voyage give different dates and different totals again. We could have quietly picked the numbers that added up. We are showing you the ones that do not, because that is what the record actually looks like when you go and read it yourself, and you deserve to know that before you start. Here, the count stops going down. Between 1852 and 1857, the Highland and Island Emigration Society assisted 4,919 men, women and children out of Western Scotland to Australia. In 1852 alone, 2,569 people went on 12 ships. They came off Skye and Harris and North Uist and Strathayard and Raasay and Iona and Ardnamurchan and St Kilda. The Hercules was one ship out of 26 across 31 sailings, and she was not even the worst of them. Go back to the line this film opened on. Malcolm McKinnon, 49, his wife Janet, their sons Alexander and Kenneth, marked in the clerk's hand as a strong, healthy man and given a promissory note of £13. The McKinnons were not on the Hercules. They sailed in 1852 on a ship called the Ticonderoga. The Ticonderoga left Liverpool that August and reached Port Phillip later that year with typhus through her decks. She was quarantined on a beach at Point Nepean, at the mouth of the bay, because there was nothing there to quarantine her in. 168 passengers and 2 of her crew died. Which brings us to the only honest thing that can be said about the McKinnons. The list tells us they got on. It does not tell us they got off. That is not a failure of the record. That is the record being what it is. A passenger list is a photograph of a gangway and nothing else. Anyone who tells you a surname database can hand you your family's fate is selling you something. What it can hand you is a name, an age, a township and a date. And those 4 things are enough to go and find the rest. So, the lists, they survive. All of them. They are held by the National Records of Scotland under the reference HD 4/5. They are arranged by ship and then by family, and Scotland's People has them online. 3 things about them, and the third is the one nobody tells you. First, what is in an entry? Scotland's People describes it as the name, the age and the residence of each emigrant, and in some cases additional notes on their health, appearance and financial status. That is how we know Malcolm McKinnon was called a strong, healthy man, and how we know Donald Buchanan of Inverness, travelling with his wife Anne and 4 daughters, was written down as a fine family and given £14. Somebody stood in front of these people and formed an opinion, and the opinion is still there. Second, how to read one honestly. The residence column is the useful one, because it names a township, not just an island, and a township is what breaks a wall, but treat every age as approximate. Malcolm McKinnon is 49 on the list and 55 in the census. Neither the clerk nor your ancestor was necessarily lying. People frequently did not know. Third, and this is the part that gets left out of every video like this one, it is free, not free to search and then pay to view. Most Scottish records on Scotland's People work that way, and the Highland Emigration records are one of the named exceptions. The National Records of Scotland says so in its own access policy. So if somebody has told you that finding your Highland emigrant ancestors starts at $30, they were wrong. 2 honest caveats, because this is the moment you would want them. You do need to set up an account, and it is free to set up, and free to view is not the same as free to download, so if you want your own copy of the page, check before you click. And if you want to stand somewhere rather than read something, the Quarantine Cemetery at Point Nepean in Victoria is a national park, and the Ticonderoga dead are in it, under a monument put up in 1856, and a second one raised by the Nepean Historical Society in 2002. Cove in County Cork is a working town you can walk around. Campbeltown is still there, at the end of Kintyre, and the harbour they left from is the harbour that is there now. 756 people got onto a ship because staying had been made impossible. 56 of them died in an Irish harbour. 17 children were sent back to the place the whole thing had been designed to empty, and 380 finished a voyage that had already taken everything it was going to take. The one thing that survived all of it, intact, was the paperwork. Go and read it. Drop your surname below. Subscribe. We will trace it.